My own name is Marianne O'Shea. I'm a lecturer in community work at university.
Sorry, Marianne, maybe to just ask people to put yourselves on mute. There's a bit of there.
Oh yeah, sorry, I don't know if I can do that from this side. That's great, thanks everyone. But yeah, so I'm a lecturer in community work here in Maynooth, and I'm going to chair this session this afternoon. And it's a session looking at participation and dialogue really, and it feels like it's a really good follow-on actually thematically to some of what we talked about already this morning. And we're lucky enough, we're going to follow a kind of similar format in that I'm going to pose a couple of questions and our two speakers are going to speak to that and to maybe open up some conversation and hopefully spark some ideas. The idea is as well that people around the room, even though we're not in a real room, but I'm looking at a full screen full of faces. So I don't know what view actually people have on, but if you click on the top right, you'll get a gallery view, which means that you don't end up looking at one of us the whole time, whoever is speaking. And you get to see maybe, and I think it'll be maybe conducive to conversation as we move into the second half of the workshop. But our two speakers this morning are Rachel Doyle from Community Work Ireland and Siobhán McLaughlin from Donegal Traveller Project. They're possibly people that both of you know well. Rachel has that national role as co-coordinator of Community Work Ireland. Prior to that, she worked with Women's Council. She's worked with Traveller Projects in the past and has had a real focus, I think, over the years on that link, and maybe something that was mentioned this morning, of both practice at a local level or practice with communities that have been traditionally excluded, and then engaging in policy spaces and looking to shift and change policies and kind of bringing voices into that room. Siobhán is another well-known face, especially across the Northwest. She's been the coordinator of Donegal Traveller Project for many years, but has also engaged and participated in many other ways, kind of systemically. So looking at different ways of engaging with the system, different ways to seek to shape policy, and different ways to encourage and enhance participation. So hopefully we'll have a good chat this morning. As I said, the format is going to be me throwing out a question casually, and hopefully Siobhán and Rachel will have something to say. So we might invite, similar to the last session, if there are kind of questions that come up along the way as Siobhán and Rachel are speaking, you might throw them into the chat and we'll go back and have a look. Or Catherine, in her role as note taker, might keep an eye on that and we'll get going. We'll look at then maybe to open the conversation. Rachel and Siobhán, one of the questions that I suppose we were talking about guiding this conversation is maybe asking you to reflect a little bit on what we might have learned around participation, and then in particular that decision making that I was glad to hear Mike raise in the opening session. So is there anything in particular that you've learned in your different contexts, either in Donegal Traveller Project or in terms of your work with Community Work Ireland, Rachel?
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Really, I suppose one of the things that struck us at the national level in terms of that decision-making piece, and what a lot of our members were saying to us, they were expressing, I think, frustration that a lot of the decision-making was being centralised, that there was a small group of people making decisions during this crisis that were affecting communities who are extremely marginalised and who are bearing the brunt of the crisis, but with very little input into the policy making surrounding the response. And the United Nations itself, and we've quoted this a few times, does call for engagement with civil society during emergencies and pandemics, and very clearly articulates that civil society and NGOs should be a core element of the kind of the response planning. And in fact, when you look at international NGOs working in crisis scenarios and situations, the evidence again shows, and Mike Ryan said it earlier on, that where you have communities there at the table guiding and feeding into the response planning process, the solutions are better. They're better. We started bringing together a group of NGOs at the very start of the pandemic. There was over 20 civil society organizations, and we met every single week for the first 6 months of the pandemic. It was homeless organizations, women's organizations, refugee council, you know, traveller groups, etc. And we came up with a set of about 56 recommendations, which we submitted to the Minister for Health and the department. And part of that was about trying to get some kind of a say, again, in terms of the decisions that were being taken. And we called for a number of seats. This time last year, in October last year, we wrote to the Taoiseach, the Minister for Health, the Chief Medical Officer and the head of the chair of the COVID-19 response committee, and called for NGO participation on NEFIT. But we didn't get anywhere with that. And we've really kind of struggled with that over the last period of time. So I think one of the things that struck us was that there wasn't space, there wasn't good space at the decision making. I know at local level there was the community response fora and so on, but in terms of actual policy development and implementation, there wasn't good engagement. We would say that's our assessment at this point in terms of COVID.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. And go ahead if you had another point. I was going to ask Siobhán maybe to reflect on that at the local level. So you're saying on the one hand, there was these kind of enclosed spaces of participation. Then, of course, as an organisation, CWI took on to try and convene some of those voices. But Siobhán, at a local level, how was that experience? And then in particular in that situation, traveller community and with other communities in Donegal, how did people participate? You know, if you think about how we as community workers seek to...
Well, I start by saying the return to normal. We do not want to return to the participative democracy systems that were in place before COVID. We have the PPN structure and a plethora of other organisations and systems and structures set up where local communities and communities of interest and marginalised communities like Traveller and Roma can be represented. However, we would question, were we really influencing change? Were we setting the outcomes from that engagement? And were we directly involved in participatory budgeting planning? Because with power comes having an influence on the budget. But we'll go back to the COVID. During COVID response, at the very start, that committee that you referred to, Rachel, the COVID response committee, we weren't invited. The Traveller organisation wasn't invited on to be represented on that. And we had to actually fight for a seat on it to make sure the needs and interests of travellers and Roma communities were there. It very quickly became evident in Donegal. Donegal Travellers Project just happened by chance at that time, not just to manage the Traveller organisation, but it also managed the Roma Community Development Project. It also managed the Building Interculturalist Black Minority Ethnic Community Development Project, and it also managed to work with the asylum seekers. And very quickly, within about 3 months, we realised that we were very much a lone voice, a lone representative, and a local contact with those communities in a big rural county in Donegal. And that if we hadn't been doing this work, we would say now that there were a lot of ethnic minorities who were living in terribly isolated circumstances, experiencing really high levels of deprivation and acute levels of poverty, food poverty. You know, they were just abandoned, migrant workers. And that if we hadn't been doing that work with our partner sister organisation, Donegal Intercultural Platform, we just wonder where those people would have found themselves and communities would have found themselves. But back to the question around participative democracy, I do think that, there are opportunities right now that we need to learn from COVID-19 and the experience. We were definitely not participating and influencing the outcomes from the LCDCs. We were not influencing the PPNs and the outcomes. The elections for the PPNs happened in Donegal. We looked for a seat for minority ethnic communities, including Traveller and Roma on that. We didn't get it. We've looked for seats dedicated to Travellers and Roma and minority ethnic community and LCDCs. We didn't get it. We're looking for seats and everything for those minority ethnic communities to be represented and participation and influence and outcomes, and we haven't got them. We are competing with 484, those communities are competing with 480 geographically based communities or communities of interest. And as Ronnie said, when it represents, mainstream democracy, our chances of winning seats were 3 independent ethnic minority, 4, in Donegal. And our chances of winning seats, because people canvass and lobby the same way as they canvass in any election. So the voices and decision-making structures of the LCDC, the PPNs, Secretariat, the linkage groups and the SPCs is not there because we can't get the votes. So we need, out of COVID, what we feel now is that the new normal has to be a new whole system put in place for participative democracy, and that rural areas and big, huge counties like Donegal, that there needs to be an exceptional step taken by the department and the local community development company or local community development committees to make sure that the voices of those communities who have no power and influence in decisions is there. And the final thing I'd say about participatory democracy, I think one of the things we learned as well as a community worker and as a community organisation, there was a risk we became gatekeepers for the state. So every time the state organisations wanted something, they rang the local community organisations or the community worker they were responsible for. They wanted us to do the job and sort out something, be that food poverty, getting people vaccinated, getting people tested, going into halting sites with, you know, the ambulance service to make sure everybody got tested. We became in a really difficult situation where the state expected so much of us because we were funded. The community had a different sets of expectations, and it was a very difficult journey for community workers to walk on or be in. And I do think that the state can't expect us to deliver all these services and such limited resources and have no say in the outcomes that happens for minority ethnic communities.
Okay.
And I've gone off point slightly, but for participative tomorrow, we stopped.
No, I think Siobhán, you've moved in actually to the next question, really talking about those challenges and opportunities. And I think it was kind of useful to leave you go in the sense of learning about participation and decision making or not being part of it came up through the COVID period, but it was actually reinforcing lessons that you were already learning before that in terms of the communities that you were working with and for. In terms of those challenges and opportunities that you're identifying. So you're talking about the challenge then of the repositioning in a way of community workers as gatekeepers in a way that's actually, I suppose, in direct contradiction to the value of community or the value of participation as it's articulated. And I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to talk more about that, even we were thinking, you know, in terms of the work that you would have involved with in the standards for community work. Participation is one of the core values of community development. And I think as Siobhán's set it out there, there's been a slight shift in what that means then in terms of workers' roles. Is there anything you'd like to say about that, or is there anything else you'd like to move into around the challenges or opportunities?
Well, I think these are the challenges. The challenges are that, you know, if the community sector and if community work and community workers are to be seen as sort of agents of government and service deliverers, that's a problem. And we've been raising this as a problem for many years before COVID and everything else since the early 2000s when we had the whole reform of local government. This has been a pattern. COVID kind of has re-emphasized that. And, you know, in a crisis situation, people will do what they have to do. They'll do the packing of the shopping bags. They'll do the stuff. They'll go out and they'll help families and do, you know, whatever they can. It's an emergency situation. However, it can't stay like that. That cannot be the be all and the end all. So we can't reverse and go back to a situation where this sector is seen as being about providing services that the state can't provide themselves. That's not our role. That's not our function. Our function is to engage. Our function is to bring our experience and our learning from working with communities to the policy making table. And there's examples of where that's happening well, but unfortunately, it's not happening well in enough instances. And we need to really, at this point in time, make our voices heard about that. I was going to talk in a little while about new movements around social dialogue at a government level and where we need to locate ourselves in that. But there's an opportunity, because I do think that during the pandemic, and our members would have said this a lot, that the state did recognise the sector, did recognise that the sector had, you know, contacts at the local level, relationships, trust, all of those things, which were, you know, invaluable in terms of outreaching to communities. So this sector and community workers had contacts on the ground with most marginalized communities. They were able to get out to them. They were able to reach them, you know, and to avoid really crisis situations for those communities. And that's what Siobhán was doing in Donegal. You know, so it was that bit about trust and relationships and knowledge of communities at the local level. And I think that the state and state agencies understood that during the last 18 months. They saw it with their own eyes, the value that brings. But again,
in terms of opportunities then.
So the opportunity is to capitalize on that, I think. It's to kind of say, look, we have shown ourselves in this crisis to be of value to the state, to communities, to society. But that value needs to be recognized. It needs to be resourced. Not to just do the same old thing of packing shopping bags, or whatever, but in fact, but to do that participation bit that we talked about earlier.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. And I saw both when Siobhán was talking and when you were talking, I saw some heads nodding. I'm on this gallery view, so I can see that people are in some ways relating, I think, what you're both saying in terms of some of those challenges, certainly over the last few months, and then the rest. Are there any other challenges or opportunities, Siobhán, that you wanted to flag? You know, we're at this very particular moment in time, and I think, you know, as pointed out in that main plenary session, there is that sense of going, okay, we've the relevant ministers sitting in the room talking to us here. There is a pilot project underway. He's talking and he's listening. Actually, I had a sense that he was listening and open to listen. So are there other opportunities that you want to flag, or is there anything in particular?
Well,
Even challenges?
I think for community development, it's great to see the pilot programme. But I do think that it's really important that community development projects like the National Traveller Partnership, whose funding has been frozen since 2008, who were, as Rachel said, you know, the first point of contact for minority communities for travellers on that occasion, are properly resourced to do their work. You know, they are running on minimal amount of money. They're expected to be, you know, influence and change at a local level with PPNs, HSE, ETBs, CIPCs, Children's Services Committees, you know, be the consultative mechanism around the National Action Plan Against Racism. We're expected to do so much work, but at the same time, on frozen budgets for so long. We're providing crisis support for families. We're doing drugs work, you know, we're doing, you know, mental health work. So I do think that one of the things is for a community worker on the ground is that we need the community development to be properly resourced to make a meaningful difference in terms of outcomes for individuals and families and communities across areas like this. And then the other thing I think in relation to ourselves as community workers, in the crisis, we were delivering plans, we were accessing resources, we're delivering programs, but we as an organisation stopped last December and January and decided we must make sure that we're not doing what the state's doing. So we went back out and worked and consulted with, you know, a third of the traveller population in Donegal. We carried out community interviews around community needs. We did a survey, we took guidance from expertise, and we produced a report on the needs and interests in travellers in Donegal, because we felt it was really important that we can give out about others, but we need to make sure that the voice of the community is embedded in our own work. And I think that's just one of the things that I think that's really useful. We did the same with the Roma community. And that meant then that when we were representing the needs of interests of travellers in Roma at a whole plethora of other bodies, we were actually doing it from a community consultation point of view, because one of the risks is that PPNs, like the new SICAP programs, or not the new SICAP has been asked to look at influencing and including particularly 5 target groups for 2022. Well, I would think that SICAP should be consulting with those communities and consulting with the organisations. And it's very important that the minister directs anybody delivering on SICAP. If SICAP includes travellers, local development companies need to talk to traveller organisations. If they include women, they need to be talking to the women's organisations and women. They need to be talking, if it's Roma, they need to be talking to Roma, you know, and, you know, if we have programmes that's about community development and inclusion, we have to talk to the communities, and the ministers need to tell those constructs that are getting resources to talk to the communities.
Yeah, no, I think that's really a useful distinction, Siobhán, that you're making as well. There's the bit about the talking to communities, but then there's the bit about communities really being involved at every stage. And I think I noted there was a comment that somebody had put in the chat in the main meeting, talking about this idea of top-down programs where there were top-down objectives already named. And so it's one thing for people to be, and the language Mike used was that idea of beneficiaries getting involved at a later stage, but actually, is there a sense that as community workers or people with a commitment to community development, we should be looking at demanding that people's voices and that their perspectives are heard in the design of the objectives at an earlier stage? So there's something about that pushback over the last while, and especially now as we seem to be in a new stage of pilot projects, things evolving. Yeah. How do we seek to do that? Rachel?
I mean, I think like we have to demand that we have an input, you know, and to be fair, I think in certain spaces there's an openness to that. And I know, like, in terms of Pobble, the new SICAP programme, we'll be meeting Pobble, talking to them about that, trying to influence the new programme. And that's really important. The opportunities that we have, I suppose, are in terms of grasping and using as tools things that have been said, you know, since 2000, since the white paper on the relationship between the community sector and the state. That is still government policy. It still is there. We need to drag it out and relook at it. You know, and that paper basically said, and I just take a quote from it, this government is making it clear back in 2000 that we have moved far beyond the attitude that statutory agencies fund voluntary organisations merely for utilitarian reasons, i.e. to provide services that the state cannot or will not deliver directly itself because of resource constraints, and goes on to talk about the value of the community sector, the importance of autonomy, all of those things. Now, after that, we saw a lot of wobbly things happening with huge cuts to the sector and central and increased power and control being given to local authorities, which a lot of us opposed at the time. But now we're in a stage where there's talk of social dialogue again, and in the programme for government, there's a commitment to kind of re-energise around social dialogue. They've set up a social dialogue unit in the Department of the Taoiseach. They're looking at new ways of engaging with the sector. And they're saying the government recognises the importance of regular and open engagement with all sectors of society. This is particularly important as we steer our way out of the pandemic, rebuild our economy and support communities that have been severely impacted by COVID-19. So there's this kind of a move towards looking at social dialogue. The current Taoiseach is definitely interested in it. I don't know about other political parties or people, but he's definitely interested in it. And we do need to start trying to engage. There will be consultation coming up about this. It's all cogs in a wheel. None of it is the answer to everything. But it's just the areas and opportunities that we can kind of try to influence and kind of get our say. You know, and we've met with the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, the Minister, Eamon Ryan, Minister O'Brien on this social dialogue issue, and we've been kind of putting forward suggestions, and we're doing some work on that at the moment. The community development programme is an opportunity. 7 new autonomous community development projects have been funded now. The department have got really behind this and have been extremely supportive of it. The Minister's really supportive of it, and as he said today, trying to look for further funding in this budget to expand that, to keep it going in the first place and to expand it where possible. So that's another kind of an opportunity and a big recognition really on the part of the department of the importance of community work and their backing for that. And then the strategy that's there as well, the inclusive empowered sustainable communities 5-year strategy says a lot of stuff in relation to, you know, looking for supporting the autonomy of the sector, independent voice, participation in decision making, and resourcing and funding. The bottom line is we can't engage and we can't participate and we can't do this stuff if we're not resourced to do it, if there isn't a strong community development infrastructure in place to actually engage in these structures and to support communities to engage in these structures. So we really need to see wider and better recognition of community work and resourcing of community development as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think it's about, Siobhán, you said that in one of your earlier contributions as well, money being power. And it's something about the recognition of the work that it takes to get people into places where they can participate. And it's work by communities themselves, and it's work by community work and community development processes and practices. And I think there's something very important about that. I see that Maria has noted a consultation and engagement process that will be taking place between DCRT and Pobal as well in terms of informing the next round of SICAP. What you might have also seen in the chat, and I see some hands beginning to come up, and I'm delighted to see that. Catherine has put in a couple of questions that we'd like people to think about, you know, and I'm, you know, obviously people have different reasons for having joined this group or selected this workshop among 6 really interesting themes. So it is about, you know, being able to hear from yourselves as well. So that question around the challenges for community work in relation to the theme, you know, in terms of that participation, are there, so Siobhán and Rachel have outlined a fairly solid range of things, both in terms of the resources, in terms of the practical spaces, in terms of engaging with existing policies and strategies, in terms of shaping new ones. So what sort of challenges are some of you identifying? And I see 2 hands have come up, or 3 hands have come up, and I think I'm going in order. I think Andy was first, Anna was second, and Ian was third. That's the order that I saw them in. So we might go to Andy.
Thanks, Marianne. Look, the contributions have been excellent so far, as usual. I think some of the challenges we experienced, I think we've become marginalised in our own processes. And what I mean from that is, I think we've been successful as community workers or as community developers, in regards to the principles of community work, in getting agreement from the state around, access to power, and that we need to create structures, platforms and mechanisms to promote a higher level of participation, which increase social dialogue, which increase the participation of people in decision making, which leads to better outcomes. But I think, when we break down that process, I think we've become marginalised in it. I think overall you have national policies that I suppose are not addressing inequalities such as housing. Then you'll have the increase in privatisation and service delivery, which is all being spoken about. But then also some of those platforms, some of those structures have been heavily designed at the last stages by statutory aid, such as PPN, that some of the platforms were involved in on the national drug strategy. So I think it's interesting that people who work across this sector, but in different departments or in different platforms, are experiencing the same barriers. And I think we need to recognise the successes in bringing the state to where we've got now in regards to access to power. But if we don't move it along to implementation and outcomes and having people embedded in all of those processes and driving them and influencing, but then all we really have is the illusion of participation. And I think that's leading to some disillusionment from communities and from community projects, which I think, if we're not careful, will lead to a disillusionment in community development, when I think that would be the wrong approach. We have to reclaim and celebrate and promote how successful community development can be, and how successful it can be and has been. But we have to recognise that the state has I suppose cajoled us into an unenviable position of being marginalised within their own process that they've reclaimed these processes as being a high level of participation, but we all know they're not working. So, and I think they've been raised in different platforms, they've been raised here, but I think it's the biggest issue for us right now, because if we don't get this right now, we'll fail in our work in regards to the communities we're trying to work with. So we have to find a way to strategize this across, developing a piece of work, developing strategies, developing recommendations that critically analyzes these processes or these structures and how ineffective they've become. And I mean, we kind of have to hold the state to account, because we're allowing them, if we don't challenge this, we're allowing them to claim that because what they are doing is claiming that these structures are working, and that they have created these in good faith, and that they have created high levels of participation, and that they're leaders in this across Europe. And I think in some ways, my experience is that, if we're not careful in addressing this and we don't do it immediately, we will continue to be seeing. I think there's an increasing that disillusionment from people is leading to an increasing worrying trend whereby community projects or community workers or community organisations are being used as a buffer from the state. So we're being used to deflect the anger. So the anger from the communities that should be directed towards the state is being directed towards the community. So I think reaffirming and reclaiming those places is what we need to do, and not losing sight of how, not thinking that community development doesn't work, that it does work, but we need to reaffirm and reclaim what that is.
Great, thanks, Andy. I think some really useful points there. It's some that are linking in with some of what Siobhán said, and some that are really building on it. It's that moment, but the moment is now. Anna, were you going to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marianne. And just really, I suppose, following up in on what Andy is saying there, and I think, like, I suppose it is that sense of it's hard not to get kind of angry really at these discussions, isn't it? But I think at the same time, as Rachel was talking there about social dialogue, like, part of us all, I know, here feel, oh geez, if we hear those words one more, we've all heard, and you get this thing, if here we go again, another lot of words. But I think there is, and we all know this, in reality, we have to, whatever the opportunities are, whatever way they come up, we have to take them. But I think it's like Andy is saying, we have to challenge, that language is our language. They've now taken all our language and written it into documents, and we all see it there. But we have to really challenge what exactly it means, and start saying this is what it means, and show what it's supposed to mean. Because it's like this. I mean, from just our experience, like working in real partnership or having real participation and all that, it's not how the state does its business. It simply isn't. When they're in crisis, they will come to you know, NGOs, community voluntary organizations when they're in crisis. That's how the whole response to the drugs issues are. In a crisis, they will come and say, we need you. In a crisis, they will recognize that. But that is not the way sort of government systems work on an ongoing basis. As I think it was somebody referred to their incredibly centralized systems that we have. Like our government departments don't even allow councils to have any say in anything, never mind. And then you get someone at your new lot aren't even elected reps, you know, and the councillors then see you as people who aren't on their side. So our system doesn't support it, it doesn't encourage it, it doesn't allow it really. And I think, but it's learned how to take all the language and use it against us, because they keep telling us all the structures are there, the committees are there, the strategies are there, the consultation processes, and we're all part of those, which we have to be. So it's all that. So I think it's a crucial thing for us. We have to start saying, and again, I think it was Mike talked about measuring. And we all sort of, when we hear about measuring, like we switch off because we think, oh God, KPIs. But we really, like, every time we've to measure, when we want to say, it really struck me, sorry, I'll try and say this quickly because it'd go on forever. Really struck me, we got a copy of, you know, those, the economic reviews of value for money, whatever it is they get done in the departments, and we got the one on the drug strategy. And the one action in the drug strategy supporting the participation of communities, that had the smallest, it had 3 pages, it has the smallest section because basically they said there's no KPIs for all this community stuff. Now again, that's the, and so we get pushed back into having to identify what happens to individuals in communities. And we have to be able to demonstrate that actually community activity, collective, has an impact. That it's a, you know, the quick example, somebody talked last week about a recovery walk they had in their local area this time instead of it being in town, and the impact that has, because you've people in the area who are dealing with the drugs issue actually seeing, oh, actually it's all right for people. The impact of community and collective and stuff, and we don't know how to measure that, but we have to show it. We're just, because
I think I'm hearing you, Anna, in that sense of both kind of demonstrating and documenting the work. Yeah, and I think some of that goes back to maybe what Rachel was talking about as well, or that idea of, so where are we involved in participating in the design of what we're talking about? So the idea, that language of KPIs, you could, you know, the confidence, sorry, go ahead, the confidence to articulate the work. Yeah. Sorry, I'd have to shut up because I just. Ugh. No, not at all, not at all. And Anna, just and it's useful for everybody who's come on just to identify what organisation you're with. I know Andy O'Hara is with Ishka, so I'll say that on his behalf. And Anna, if you want to identify yourself and any of the subsequent speakers. Yeah, it's Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign. Yeah, we're involved Anna. In the National Drug Strategy Committees for a long and painful number of years. Not to you've muted yourself. But thanks a million. And look, I think there was something that you captured there as well that Andy was talking about, that illusion of participation. So the disillusion, not the illusion of participation, I think is something that we need to begin to challenge. I see Ian was the third person with their hand up. And if there was anybody else that wants to come in at this juncture, or again, if Siobhán or Rachel, if you want to come back and comment on anything that any of the participants are saying, or, you know, this is really a conversation space. And I'm conscious, I think we have another 15 minutes in terms of time. Am I incorrect? I think I'm correct. So I want people to make sure they feel they can have their voices in.
I think we have a bit longer, Marianne. We're back at, it's 1:45 and we're back at 10 past.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, we'll keep going. So look, I'll go to Ian next, and then maybe back to Rachel and Siobhán for some comments on some of those issues that people are bringing up and maybe your own sense of it. Ian.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll try and keep it brief, even if we have an extra few minutes.
And where are you from, Ian? Just to throw it in, sorry, since I wasn't asking people.
So, sorry, I'm involved in Clarecastle community development here in beautiful, windy and wet west of Ireland. I'm also a member of the board of Volunteer Ireland. But I suppose my experience down through the years is, even from the times at national level of partnership negotiations and down through the PPN and LCDCs, a lot of these structures seem to be set up to keep people inside the tent. Rather than being outside complaining, is to kind of drag you in. And it actually uses up a huge amount of resource and effort and all that. And I think people have talked about their frustrations in engaging in these various different participative fora. But unless we come up with an alternative, we'll just continue to be complaining. I think and I don't have the answers. I'm throwing out the question, really. as to, you know, if we were given this to start off with, if we were to start from a blank page, what would it look like? And that's the key challenge for us to figure out. Now, I think we're all agreed that we need more participation and the government should give us more, but until we can figure out what that looks like, it's going to be very difficult to persuade them that we can do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's useful, and thanks. And we talked about, when we were thinking about this workshop, we were talking about that idea of community development is this movement always from the real to the ideal. And it is a little bit, on the one hand, we're hearing on the one hand what the real is at the moment, and also kind of glimmers maybe from some of you about what the ideal is, and then what do we want it to look like? And that might be a good question to throw back to Siobhán and Rachel. So in an ideal world, what would meaningful, effective participation look like? And I think it was, Anna, you were starting to talk about it there, the state or the shape of our democratic processes as they exist doesn't, you know, limits us to some degree. So people have been using that term this morning a lot. So that's the framework of representative democracy. So look, if you're looking to represent, that's working. But as community workers and as community development workers, are we looking to engage in a different, or to shape and to be involved in a different type of democracy? So that idea of participatory democracy, where people, the relationship with the state, and who is the state, and if we are the state, who is the we? You know, is there something about pushing that a little bit differently? Is there anything about that, Siobhán or Rachel?
Sorry, there's one other point I meant to make, sorry. There might be also some scope in terms of newer technology for how we can participate on a broader base. That might be something we need to look into as well.
Yeah. And of course, being conscious about, so yes, things like this can happen, but who's not here? You know, what voices are excluded from newer types of technology as well? So just being conscious of that. Thanks, Ian. Siobhán, Rachel?
Rachel, do you mind? I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that, do we want to go, we had the county community forums, we had the city community, do we want to go away and start all over again around participative democracy structures? I think you think about who crafted citizen engagement, is that what you call the last policy document? I think that just an example I gave was like the PPN Secretariat in Donegal. From a BME traveller number perspective, we would argue that affirmative action should be taken and those communities should be represented, and others, under the 9 grounds of the equality legislation, and that we shouldn't have to compete in a representative democracy model to get votes to get onto those, that there should be a seat for, we should be guaranteed around gender equality, disability, LGBT, travellers, Roma, BME, and departments could lead on that and given and directed instruction. The same for the LCDC, Traveller Accommodation Committee, LTACC, 3 traveller reps maximum, they're legislated for committee, the rest 6 county councillors and council staff. Are 3 traveller reps going to have the power to influence the final decision making at those committees, or are they going to become problematic spaces where we problematize travellers because we're fighting against that? I think we could make time and space to decide what the existing structures might change to make it more participatory and where we have more power and where we have more influence. And maybe we need to do that collectively, which is one of the things I'd written down here. Greater solidarity at a local level. In fact, there's lots of allies out there in local development companies and others. Find those allies and talk about, have spaces like we're having today at a local level to talk about, well, how do we make a real change and how do we build solidarity in a county like Donegal? Because when the constructs, be the PPN, setting up linkages groups, have the control and power, we're only arriving at the meeting with an agenda already set, and we've been asked to be the chair or the convener or the note taker, when really we should be calling the meeting. And we used to have more opportunities like that historically, and maybe we need Ian to reclaim those spaces and create real participative democracy local, where we're shaping the agenda and telling those people what those structures should look like. Children's Services Committee in Donegal has no community rep. You know, why do we accept that for so long and give out about it?
Great, thanks, Siobhán. And I think that goes back to something that Andy threw into the mix as well, talking about that idea of spaces, you know, strategize and to critically analyze the spaces that we're involved with, you know, and in the midst of all the other things that I suppose as workers you're seeking to do, how do we continue to do that? And how do we, you know, maybe how do we generate some of those spaces? Rachel, is there anything that you wanted to add at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about the rigidity of structures as well that are there. I think structures should reflect what it is we're trying to do. They should reflect what it is we're trying to achieve, be it on, you know, and the people who are most affected by those decisions are the ones who need to be at the table. That's it. That's not the case at the moment. You have tight structures. If you're not on it, you don't get a seat. You're looking to be voted, blah, blah, blah. That shouldn't be the case. You know, we need recognition of the community sector and of their right to participate, number one. But we also need structures that are flexible enough to be able to respond to change in dynamics, different issues that are happening, and have the correct people there at the time, not to get stuck in. And we talked about this nationally, about the community and voluntary pillar being the main mechanism for engagement at national level between the community sector and the state. And we're sort of saying, we think we need to do things differently. We need to look at homelessness, for example, and say, okay, so who are the organizations that need to be at the table around these discussions? It's the people who are most directly affected and the organizations representing them, end of. And, you know, so it's about having looser, flexible, adaptable structures and mechanisms for engaging and participating, not being tied into the PPN, the LCDC.
As I hear you speak, Rachel, I think of that idea of form following function. So
yeah,
function and then
exactly
form. And there's another, that notion of institutional bricolage. You make things take on the shape. Just because something exists as it does, it doesn't mean that it must always exist way, and things can change and evolve.
So, and we've said what we don't want is lack of representation. We don't want tokenism. We don't want consultation, to be told what to do and let's hear your view and goodbye and we'll come back next year and tell you what we did with it. That's not what we're looking for.
I don't want to interrupt the flow, but I noticed I missed somebody leaving earlier, and I see somebody else has said they need to leave shortly. Is there anything you'd like to throw into the mix before you have to leave? Natasha, not to put you on the spot, but I know I missed somebody else. I think they've already gone. Is there something else? And then Rachel, we might come back to you then.
For me, it's just useful to hear this input. I've formerly a SICAP staff member, but now in a PPN. So I hear all of the backgrounds, and I appreciate the frustrations with the structures, because of course as a PPN staff member I'm also, you know, in that mix too, and caught between that community sector and indeed the structures that are set out for us to operate in. So I suppose I'm really just kind of taking it in and trying to see, you know, what steps we can take in our own PPN to try and improve that access and participation.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks a million, and thanks for being here. You'll get the rest of it on the recording.
Great.
With Catherine's wonderful notes. Thanks a million. As I go back to Rachel for a minute, are there any other comments, or is there any other bit of relating some of what you've heard, your own experience, the work that you're involved in, the issues that you're engaged with, the things that are important to you? And maybe as people are thinking about that, just to go back to you, Rachel, sorry for interrupting you in full flow there.
I mean, I don't have, Ian, you know, you asked a question, what is it that we're looking for? What if we had a blank page would we be asking for? And I think we'd be asking for certain, like on the one hand, we'd be asking for certain values to be articulated and meaningfully adhered to. And then we'd also be looking for structures that are accessible to people, that are inclusive of the most marginalized communities, and that are meaningfully listening and reporting back and accountable back. We don't have those kind of things happening at the moment. You know, that's just not the reality. So we want to move to an ideal that's much more deeply embedded and committed to participation. And we as the community sector, we're challenged by that as well. And I was struck by what Mike Ryan even said earlier about, you know, there's negotiation. There's always going to be negotiation. There's always going to be a bit of kind of give and take. What do we give? What do we take? All of that. But at the end of the day, given that, you know, as community workers, we're working with the most marginalized communities who never get to have a say and don't get many of the resources, you know, we're pretty, you know, I think we need to hold strong actually in terms of what we're looking for, because we don't have much to negotiate on when you're talking about basic human rights and basic things like traveller accommodation. Where's the negotiation on that? So I do think that, you know, those kind of spaces, they can be made real, but we do need political, you know, commitment to that, and we need commitment on the part as well of the civil servants. And we've been very struck by and some are here, but civil servants in the department that we work with, we've kind of built a good relationship there, and there's good things happening. And a lot of it is about that, trying to build relationships and learning from each other and all that kind of stuff. If there's an openness there on the part of individuals, that can be very positive.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And I think that's a really useful bit, and it's going back maybe to what something that Siobhán had said earlier as well, about that bit of the resourcing to get as far as the resourcing. So if, for example, on the LTACC, you have traveller representatives sitting alongside people who are paid professionals, who their full-time job is to do this, you know, what about the work that needs to happen, or the resources that need to be operationalized, or whatever word you want to use, in order to make sure that those who are in representative spaces can sit and be there effectively, you know, and meaningfully. So it's the work before the work in that sense, and then the work to support after the work. So beyond the meetings, beyond and the idea that and I think something, and Anna, you might know a little bit more about it, thinking about some of the drug task force spaces as well, that idea of people representing their community in a space alongside others who have much more significant resources at their hands, and, you know, maybe support. You know, how do the structures, how do the budgets recognize and resource some of that work that needs to happen? So I think that's really useful. Rachel, you were brave enough, or you mentioned some of the civil servants that might have been brave or foolhardy enough to sit in on this session, and I just wonder if this is a moment that somebody would like to give a perspective from that other side. You know, so if you're engaged, if you're representing the state, or if you're in that space, how do you seek to create, if you're what we're saying or hearing about participation, you know, recognizing constraints that might exist on that other side of the table? Is there anything that can be done, or how can that be approached? Is there any of I'm not sure who's here on that, from that side, but is there anybody brave enough to throw their hand in on that? I see a hand up, Deirdre Kelly, and I see. Yeah. Great, Deirdre.
Not to put you on the spot there, Deirdre.
Thanks,
so
Rachel.
I think it's interesting to hear all the perspectives, you know. So, and I see is Michelle, another person.
Yeah.
Her mic is off. But look, is there something to be said then?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is a really, really interesting conference, and this morning's session was just fantastic. And this session is so interesting. And the main reason myself and Michelle signed up for this session is because we both work on the 5-year strategy for the C&V sector, and we both work with Rachel and Anne and Anastasia and all you guys on that side as well. And we have done for a few years now. So we're very aware of the whole participation side and the need for it to be better than it is. And we are trying, and I think Rachel alluded to it, we are trying our best to try and do that. But the main reason I came in here was to see if there was any sort of insight into how we do that. So like, I've learned a good bit here and in this morning, but what it has done really for me is just really underpinned what I knew to be true anyway. So the question now is, how do we move forward? We are where we are. That's, you know, I mean, I know that sounds trite, but it's the truth. We are where we are, and we as civil servants, while we will work towards what we believe and what we know to be where we would like to be, we are constrained by a number of different things, not least of which is financial constraints, but that's only one of the constraints. There are other constraints too, but we have to work with you guys to try and be innovative around how we deal with those constraints and how we address those constraints and try and work around them. The funny thing is that I've been reassigned, my work area has been reassigned, and I'm actually moving on to the PPN side of the house. I actually moved on to the PPN side of the house yesterday. So I'm very new to that side. Mind you, I would have had a fair amount of interaction with them by the nature of the work that I was doing on the strategy. So I'm learning from the two sides through this conference here this morning, and will bring what I've learned from the C&V strategy side over onto the PPN side, and try as much as we can to try and address the issues that I've heard here this morning. And there's a few things that we did. on my other side of the house as well, I also had responsibility for the LCDCs and the LECPs. And I think we've done some work in the last few months around the LECPs, because we've been producing a guideline to try and reinforce the importance of consultation and participation through the LECP process. And we are going to be working with Pobble on a project that specifically looks at engagement and participation of the most marginalised in that LECP process. So it'll be happening, that the examination of that will be happening at the same time as the process is happening. So we feel that it's a good timing to try and see if there's what we can do to get the most marginalised in our communities engaged with these processes in a meaningful way. And I noted what was said this morning about meaningful, and I really do feel that that is, it's something I often say in what I'm saying at any meetings is this cannot be a tick box exercise. It has to mean something, and it has to mean something to the communities in which we're dealing with. So look, all I can say is I've learned a huge amount this morning. Mike Ryan was just like, I mean, I think he should be Taoiseach at this stage, but anyway, that's beside the point. He makes so much sense, and his language is so accessible, and it was great. Sometimes when you're a civil servant, you need these kind of things to kind of bring things back into focus. So from a more higher end perspective this morning, right down to the local perspective this afternoon, it's been a really good event for me. And I hope that I'll be able to apply the learning in our work with you guys going forward.
Thanks, Deirdre. And I see a couple of hands coming up, but I was given one job other than to try and keep this moving along, was to come back with a call to action. And it'll be Catherine that'll be mortified if we haven't come up with one, because as the note taker, I think she's feeding back, if I'm correct. But actually, I'd just like to draw people's attention to Andy made an excellent point in the chat there as well, and I might invite you back in to talk about that further. And I see Anna's hand is up, and I don't know was it a historical hand or not, but is there a sense that if we have to do this one, what is our call to action then? Is there anybody, what are you struck by? My sense is around, it's really stupid, but it's the action. So there's something about what Rachel was saying there about or maybe my own take on it, that the form following the function. Is there, or what is our call to action? Is anybody struck by that call? And maybe a minute. I think Ali came and told us we had 10 minutes, so we're 4 minutes past now. So we have 6 minutes. Anna, I might invite you to come in as people are thinking, but if you could just take a moment, that call to action. What are we asking for? We have one sentence to really throw back into the mix.
Yeah. Just really, really quickly, just listening to Deirdre, I was struck that, I was saying when we started off with the drug strategy, when it really was genuine kind of partnership and involved in decision making. It's interesting because it was based in the Department of Community, Rural and Gaeltacht, but it was dealing with what's a health issue, which actually belongs in another. So it's that idea but it allowed for a while a community development approach to a key social issue to be evolved. And it's like, how do we, and the example of how it worked for a while under the National Drug Strategy Team, it's there, like we actually were part of it. Like, that's what frustrates me so much. I sat on a real, genuine, proper operating decision-making committee that involved community representation. I sat on one. It's gone now for all sorts of reasons. But I think there's something about a community development approach to any issue, whether it's a health issue, a justice issue, that has to be promoted. That community development is not, because it's presented now by health. Well, that's another department's area. It's something about community development is an approach that you apply to all of these key social issues, and that's what worked in the early days of the strategy, because we were lucky we ended up in the Department of Community Development. But there's something about that I think we need to be presenting it that way, because it's seen as another set of actions or a separate set of, just that.
I think that's really useful, Anna. So it's that taming, and it is that community development is an approach, it's a discipline, it's a profession, it's a practice, and that is really an important starting point. And having that sense of that recognition then allows that lens to be placed on different issues. Rachel, were you going to come back in on something?
Andy's trying to get back in.
Oh, Andy, sorry.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like what Anna said, like we know what works, like the solutions, we know what the solutions are, and we know what the processes are. So the call to action for me is identifying where we know this isn't happening and holding the state to account, like, so collectively. as community workers, in the platforms we're on, in the structures we're on, raise it consistent, and then collectively, as community work oil than everyone else, let's campaign on it, let's lobby on it. And as Anna says, there are examples of how this works. Oppressed people do have the answers, communities have the answers, and we have platforms and structures and principles and values as in community work as to how this process works. What we've missed is people at the top have marginalized that process. So the call to action is to reinforce and reaffirm community development works. We have evidence that it works. Let's challenge and systemically try and critically analyze how we can change the platforms and structures that aren't adhering to those principles and values.
Great, thanks, Andy. That's really strong. I'm also conscious, as we're coming to the end, that there are a couple of voices that haven't spoken. So I see Connie and Kathleen, Shannon, Maria, Michelle. There's a few. Is there anything that people would like to add or to throw in at this point? And Maria, I see you put your hand up. You're welcome to join in.
Yeah, and thanks, Marianne. I suppose I work with Pobble, and I primarily work in the SICAP program and other social inclusion and quality programs. But I come from a community development experience background external to Pobble, so I'm coming from that experience as well. And one of the things that strikes me, and I have said to numerous other similar fora like this, is we, as people who've worked in the community development sector, know the impact of community development. And Andy is right, we see the evidence of community development. And we are in this group here talking to the converted in terms of community development. But there is a challenge in terms of showing the impact of community development external to this group and external. That is the challenge that we have. We're all community development is critical in terms of positive outcomes for disadvantaged communities and for addressing social exclusion. I firmly believe that. I've seen the evidence of it. But telling the story of it and telling the narrative and showing the impact of it is a challenge. And it's something that collaboratively we need to look at. And it needs to be resourced as well. That is a critical element of it. The resourcing of it is important. Because it can't happen out of thin air either. But it is a challenge that we have faced in SICAP in terms of showing the impact of community development. And that is a real challenge for us.
I think that's useful, Maria, thanks. I think Mike Ryan talks about it today on that meta scale of thinking, health outcomes are decades long and political processes aren't. Similarly, community development moves beyond the budget cycles that are allocated to it. I'm conscious, I think, Andy, your call was a really strong one. I definitely got a bit of a spark in my belly when I heard you say it, so I'm delighted to hear it. I thought I saw Rachel Doyle documenting it, or did Catherine Lane did somebody write it down? Do we have a statement that we want to come with, or do you want to give us one more crack at it, Andy?
There's someone better wrote it down, because that's it, it's gone.
It was inspiration and it's gone for us. But Catherine, did you?
I think it was about reinforcing and reaffirming community development as approach, reaffirming that community development works. And then there was the bit about community, Anna, I think to add into it might be the bit about community development as reinforcing community development as approach, not just in the Department of Rural and Community Development, but across departments, an approach to health inequalities, an approach to drug issues, an approach to homelessness and housing. So we're trying. There was
a question that I never got as far as asking yourself and Siobhán today about talking about how we restore the practice of community work, a practice of community work that catalyses and facilitates participation and change ultimately. So it's how do we go back to that sort of community work? So recognizing we were in a crisis over the last 18 months, but looking to move to community work that is the spark, the spark that changes something.
And how do we, like we always talk about collective action, and because we're all sitting here and there's excellent contributions and really good processes and ways of doing things, but how do we as a group collectivize that? Like we talk about the local, the national, the regional, as a community worker and as a community organization you work in, how do you tackle what we said in your platforms? And then how do we collectively as community workers, because we talk about it consistently and there is loads of collectivized work, but so we keep coming back. Is there one piece of work? Is there one campaign we do? Is there one plan that we all have where we all agree to raise it at our different platforms and then measure where it's going on, and that we collectively continually raise it and measure what the outcomes are, what the responses are from the state.
Yeah, I think that's great, Andy. I think that's what our call, and that's how we respond, I think, to our own call. I just want to say thank you to everybody before we get cut off. Thanks in particular to Rachel and Siobhán for leading out on a really interesting conversation. Thank you to all of you that had a comment, whether in chat or using your voice. And thanks to those who were listening as well. That's an important part of it. I hope that everybody got something. Hope you were listening because it was of value, not just because you were stuck in the workshop. And thanks. I think what was really useful was getting the different perspectives. We got a bit national, we got a bit of local, we got a bit of the state, we got something from Pobble. So we have that sense and some of the historical experiences as well, Anna, that you talked about. So some of this isn't new. Well, lots of it isn't new. It's happened before. There have been success stories, and now it's about documenting it. It's about advocating for it, and it's about fighting for it. And I suppose if there's, you know, my own interest in community development might have come from the fact I like a good fight. And I think lots of community workers, it's a good way of focusing our energy and that capacity to challenge and to, I suppose, ultimately look for a better society and a better world for us to live in. I think that's really why any of us are at what we're at. And I hope that, you know, I'm glad to hear, Deirdre, that coming from the other side, you know, professionally, you have that sense of coming today and hearing something of value and getting reminded again of some of the expertise and some of the knowledge and some of the experience that's committed to some of the same things that you might be committed to yourself.
Marianne,
So,
I can share will I share just the Jamboard the way I've written it?
Do.
Yeah.
That'd be great. I wasn't aware of the technology end of things.
So we're not going to give we're not giving
Conference
feedback
sharing.
at the end. We're all just given, you know, what's our call to action. So each workshop will do that.
Brilliant.
But
I
we are
just-
recording
yeah.
this workshop, so.
Yeah.
So reaffirming and reinforcing that community development works, maybe recognizing that it needs resourcing and investment, and acknowledging that it's an approach that needs recognition across different departments responding to different inequalities, maybe. So maybe not just.
Yeah, it's not just health inequalities, it's all inequalities.
Yeah, so all inequalities.
I think it must have cut me off with word count there or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great. And then
I just put in the other point there as well,
Yeah.
just in terms of that whatever
And just to-
models are put forward are, they're underpinned.
Exactly.
with certain
So
values.
asking, and I might say demanding, listening to what people are saying in the room this morning, it's time to make demands again, you know, and to acknowledge while we're reflecting on what's happened and how things have changed, but it's demanding that certain values underpin basis for decision making and participation, being inclusive, realistic, accountability, and being made up of the people who are most affected. I think, I don't know, I can't see people's faces now, I must go back, but I'd be confident that really reflects some of what we've talked about today. Are others, are people, if you want to, I see some nodding heads, those that brilliant. So I think that's a good morning's work for everyone. Is there anybody that wanted, I see thumbs up, is there anybody that wants to add anything? I'm very conscious that oh no, workshops are ending. We made it to the end. So look, thank you all. Thanks to
everybody.
Bye.